What we have here is the bracket that I ordered from Performance Online. This bracket is going to mount the power steering pump and the alternator on the driver's side of our inline 6 235. The bracket is very well made, but keep in mind this is also a universal bracket, so there may be a little bit of modification for you to do like I had. So I'm going to run through some of the stuff that I had to do to make this bracket work. Now, the principle behind this bracket is that the crank pulley is going to drive the power steering pump, and the power steering pump is going to use a double pulley on it, which one of those will drive the alternator. So one of the first things that I noticed is that the power steering adjustment bracket, I ended up having to draw file this out. Must have had a dull end mill when they machined this bracket, which, I mean, that's not a big deal. That can easily happen. It could have been plasma cut and the plasma head was slightly out. Now, the second thing that I noticed that I had to do with this is I also had to notch out a little bit of the boss on the power steering pump right in this area here. Now, I noticed when I was moving it back and forth to see what we've got for adjustment in it, like this one, how this is rounded, you can see where it was machined. I basically just had to straighten this out a little bit. And there's lots of meat in here. This isn't going to leak or anything if we cut this back a little bit, so no big deal there. The other thing that we ended up having to do, now, when I installed the pulley, and I'm just going to mock it up for now. That slides on there. I ended up having to use a button head screw on this side here instead of a regular bolt. And the reason why is when I had a regular bolt in there with a lock washer and a flat washer, it ended up hitting the pulley. So to gain a little bit of clearance, I just use a button head screw, which is actually a grade 8 bolt rated for, whereas it just had regular grade 5 bolts in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the bracket, and when I install the power steering pump, I'm going to leave the pulley off, Loctite this in, and then so that it still swivels, then tighten it here, and it gets tightened up on the bracket anyway. That's more to just hold it in place to keep tension on the belt. So one other thing that had happened on this, which is sort of a two-part problem. Now, the first part was this spacer in here is one that I ended up having to make, which was 1/2 inch, because the spacer that came with this was 3/4 of an inch. Now, I'm not all that certain that if I would have put that 3/4 inch spacer in there, or even used a porta-power to push this out, that this would have really worked with this pulley. Now, I'm not sure if there's other pulleys available that aren't so deep as this one, but this one didn't work, so this was my workaround to try and make it actually work. So the other thing that ended up happening on me was when I went to install my alternator, this bar here, I ended up having to take the porta-power and push it out a little bit and straighten it. Now, that's not really the problem with the manufacturer. This is the kind of stuff that we come across normally when we're building stuff like this. And I think all that really was is when it was welded, it just shrunk a little bit after it cooled. And I mean, I didn't really even have to move it out that much, maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. I think I've got a workaround here. I can make everything go together without having any alignment problems on the belts. And I mean, I'm obviously going to check it and make sure everything aligns before I actually run the engine anyway. So what we're going to do now is we're going to install this, and now that everything's bench fit and we've got everything so that it fits, and actually install it on the car. Now, I think this is going to be kind of a neat and tidy system. This is one of the better ones that I'd found on the internet. There's a few on eBay and stuff like that, but they weren't as clean and nice looking. Like, this looks like pretty well it could be stock brackets, which is kind of the look that we're going after. I don't want anything fancy hanging off the edge, or, you know, some kind of weird bracket with skulls laser cut in it or anything like that. I just want something plain, functional, and looks pretty good at the same time. Now that we've got our assembly installed, we've got our power steering pump and our alternator actually on the engine. Now we can start to see where we've got a few issues. So one of the things is this still has the factory fan on it. You can see here, boom, it's hitting the pulley on the power steering pump. Now I don't know if you can really see this, but they're not aligned yet. Now I've got a lot of clearance that I can still move that back. The headers are still clearing. I can still almost fit my hand through there, so I can come back probably about a ½ inch still. I'll do an adjustment there, but these old flex fans, they have two habits. Now, one of them is when they start pulling, the blades flex back. So as they're pulling, they still have a possibility of hitting the snout on that power steering pump. And the other thing that happens is they're starting to show their age and they get work hardened, and I've heard of horror stories of guys having them fly through the hood. So we're going to try and eliminate that. We're going to try and go with a front mounted fan on this thing. Now I'm going to have to remove the horn off of this and try and get the fan in there. Well, hopefully the one that I bought is going to fit. So here's where we get to the part where I don't know what I'm doing, so to speak. So this is the first electric fan I've ever installed, and I really want to go with the biggest electric fan that I can. I've got a 16-inch and I've got a 14-inch. Now the 14-inch fits, but I'm not really too excited about the CFM rating on it, which is only 1750, and the minimum you want to go with the 6-cylinder is around 2000. This fan here is about 2300, but I'm having a couple clearance issues with it. Now for the wiring that goes in front of the rad, there's a bar that goes across there that's actually spot welded into the rad support. And I took the hub puller and I was trying to pull it out. I was trying to pull it up and it's not moving, and I don't want to wreck something. So what I'm going to do is cut the housing here. Obviously I'll make these cuts a lot straighter after I get it cut out. There's a lot of clearance in here still where I can get it to work. Then I'll just fill the top here with something to make the airflow go all the way through. I wanted to paint this black anyway. It's pretty much the only one that I could get today. And because this is a puller fan, I want to make it into a pusher fan. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the fan off and reverse the hub on this one. Now you might think that I've hacked up this electric fan, because that's exactly what I did. Now I'm not too happy with what I did here, but once it's installed, it's actually very surprising how much this actually works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scuff it down a bit and I'm going to paint it black, because this thing is pretty freaking tacky. And we will keep going. One of the first things we've got to think about when we're wiring in a fan is where we're going to take our power from. Now we know that we're putting in an electric fan. I'm running fast EFI. So where we have to bring our power from, our main power, into a relay, and then take our trigger signal off of our EFI. So where I want to start, obviously, like I said, is to start with our main power. Now our main power coming in is going to be fused power, just in case we have an issue with our alternator and then we don't fry everything along the way. So this holder here, I've taken and I've stripped the ends, and you want 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of wire showing. And you want to get yourself a good set of strippers. Now these are Klein, these are a little bit spendy, but they really do the job and they are outstanding for what they do. So I'm going to start off with the red wire. I always like to use red as our standard main power coming in. And I'm going to feed it in our 1/2 inch. Maybe I'll give it a little bit more than that. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to take our wires and I want to feed them into each other like this. Then we're going to twist them together. Once we've got them twisted together like that, I want to take our soldering iron, get our solder a little bit ready here. Just set it on your soldering iron like this. Now, sometimes this takes a little while to heat it up, get things going for us. Pretty cold in the garage today, so might take a little bit to get this going. We've got to be careful that we don't burn the sheathing on either the holder or on the wire coming in. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of a dab on there to try and tin it a little bit. Hopefully that'll get us going. It'll get us started. Now you can see that on the other end where I'm holding it, it's stuck, so we don't have enough heat in there yet to try and get this going. Once we get this going, you'll see it really start to sink in. Oh, there we go. Now it's starting. And we just want to try and cover our connection just enough that it's going to stick. I can see my sheathing is starting to turn a little black on the red side. There, now that's a good connection. We'll just let that cool off a little bit. Next thing we want to do is we want to cut ourselves a little bit of heat shrink sleeve. And we want to make sure that we have enough to cover both ends. By the time that cools off, I don't want to put it on when it's hot because then it'll just shrink on there without being able to actually cover our connection. It should be cool to the touch. That's still a little bit warm. Cool that off a little bit. I'll get it started. Sometimes our connection's a little bit bigger than what our sheathing is. So you can take and stretch it out over the end of a pen. Trying not to tear it. Now I got it on all the way. So I want to make sure that we have a nice waterproof seal on this. Then we'll just take a lighter, shrink that down. And that'll be a nice waterproof seal. Now on this other end, I'm going to start off by cutting off a little bit of sheathing before we even get going. The reason why I want to do that is I want to get it far enough to the other end that when I go to put my terminal on, and I'm not going to get it hot and make it shrink to the that square, make it shrink to the wire before we even get it going. So this is cool enough I can actually touch it. It's not going to affect the sheathing at all. Slide this all the way up. And again, we want to make a fairly healthy fairly healthy cut off of there. Twist this around. Now, I usually get rid of these. I don't think they're really that great. So what I do is I hold it with a pair of pliers like this. Just take some cut-offs. Try to pull that off. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is these are just crappy crimpers. But I just want to get it in there so that it's going to stay. And then we'll solder that in anyway. I'm a real advocate of soldering things. I've had before where I put on the crimp terminals and then eventually ended up with problems because either they vibrate loose or they're not terminated properly or good enough. And we want to avoid that kind of thing, especially on a car. I mean, we're going to be driving this thing and it's going to be vibrating quite a bit. So let's do everything we can to try and prevent any kind of issues for the future. Give that a good squeeze. Straighten that out a bit. Now this will be relatively the same as the last piece that we did, but what I usually do with these, because it's a lot harder to get in there, is I'll actually stick it through my soldering iron like this. Or like this. Start to warm that up a little bit. Get some of my solder going. And it usually takes a little bit longer for these because there's a lot more stuff to get warm here. The same thing, we'll try and tin it a little bit. Still not quite hot enough. Usually you'll see it start to come through the other side once it gets hot enough. There we go. Now that's sort of, you could almost see that boil through as that was coming through. Now we'll let that sit a little bit. Let it cool off. Didn't burn the jacket at all. It's a little bit tacky if you feel it, but that'll be a good connection. A little bit warm. Just set that on the middle part of the bench, cool off a little bit. Push it down while it's still somewhat pliable. Cool off, and then we'll wrap our shrink sleeve around there. We'll be golden on our power in. We're using a standard Bosch relay. So the normal terminals on this is white is 87, which is 12 volt switch. Now 12 volt switch I put into a red wire. Now the caution with this is even though we have up close to the ECU we have switch power, we don't want to be drawing off of that because we don't want to interfere with what our computer is doing. So I'm going to run this straight back to the switch inside the cab. Then we've got terminal 86. This is the blue wire going from our fast. So this is a ground wire, and it might sound a little funny, but the wire in the fast is actually a negative output, which will engage our switch, make our switch work whenever whatever inputs we put into the computer we tell it to come on, that's when it's going to come on. And then once the temperature drops down, that's when it's going to turn off. This one here is to fan. So this will be terminal 87, which originally was yellow. This is where we cut it off here. So although this is a black wire, this is going to go into our, I wanted to indicate that this is going to go into the black wire on our fan. Because we're using our fan as a pusher, not a puller, we had to reverse the blades and reverse the polarity on the fan. This is 87A. We don't need that one. And then the blue one here, this is our battery positive that we turn into red, that we're going to have our main feed coming in. We've also got this brown wire here. Now this brown wire is going to go battery negative, and then to the negative side of our fan, which is going to be our blue wire. Normally the blue wire, like I said, is going to be our positive, but because this fan needs to run backwards, we're reversing the polarity on it. Now our two wires that are going to run up underneath the hood, I put sheathing on them here because I want to protect them, plus I want to make everything look neat and tidy. It doesn't look good when you've got colored wires running all over the place on a car, and we'll keep things nice and tidy. Now the ends I never terminated with anything. So this red one, I'm just going to leave loose like this. The blue one here is going to get spliced into our fast, and I'm going to run a wire from the cab out to the engine bay and then terminate it underneath the engine bay, just to make things a little bit easier rather than trying to run one wire all the way through. And I'm just going to tape this up so it doesn't come apart, but if I need to pull it back, I can always just cut it real easy with the razor blade, and then I'll just tape it off and hide it inside of some of the other sheathing that I have for the other wiring that's running the fuel injection and other pieces of our engine management. Now I've gone ahead and drilled a hole in the rad support. I've put this rubber isolator on here because when you mount a relay, you don't really want them to take a lot of vibration. It can end up ruining them from shaking them too much. I had a few left over from some other kits that I have, but you can buy these from most industrial suppliers and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is, now that we have our relay wired up, I'm going to try and neatly get a bunch of the wires inside of where the battery is. Now that I have the battery out, I have a little bit of room to work. Screw this in, and then try and run our wires out to the front of the car. The biggest thing in this is to try and organize everything very well. The more work you do organizing now means less work for you later, i.e. trying to redo connections and stuff like that. Now I already know that I have clearance for my battery in here because I already test fit this. And let's see, our isolator is going to work good. I've gone around to the front, and I've also drilled a hole in the front through the rad support as well. I'm going to run the wires through, and then I've got a grommet that I'm going to feed the wires through. You always want to use a grommet because you don't want to abrade your wires, and eventually you're going to have a bunch of shorts that you're going to try and chase around. And I can tell you from personal experience that can be quite extensively lengthy and a total mind blow trying to get that sorted out. So like I said, plan ahead, make sure everything is going to work, make sure everything's organized. So here we are with the hole that I drilled. This is a 1/2 inch hole for our grommet to protect our wires. Now I've got our grommet set where I want the wires to stay put. So I'm going to have a little bit of a nice wrap in the back, and I've got some split sheathing here on the that I'll put on the other side just to hide it. And it's going to be behind the battery anyway, you're not really going to see it. So we've got our fan power and our fan negative here. So I didn't want to wrap it. I can wrap a big piece of sheathing around this and then to the fan wires out front just to hide it later. But for now, I just wanted to focus on trying to get the wires in here. Set our grommet up here. Let's take a screwdriver. Try to poke our flange into the hole. We've got lots of room in this grommet, so shouldn't be much of a problem. But it can be a bit of a bear to get these started. I'm trying not to rip it at the same time. And one little piece in the bottom. Give it a little spin. Make sure it's seated all the way. And there's one little piece sticking out there. We'll get that pushed in there. There, and we're done. Now I'll just spin these wires a little bit to hide the brown and the black one in the bottom, back to where it was, how I had it set up. And we're good to go. Now I'm going to spend some time trying and mount the fan, which actually ended up working out a lot better than what I originally thought that it would. So we'll get to that next. So here we are with our fan mocked up. You can see that I had to do a little bit of clearance for this bar right here. Now, that's not really going to interfere with anything. This fan is relatively the same size as the fan that was on the car originally, and fairly close to the same position. So I'm not too worried about not cooling enough with this fan. Plus, the beauty about this fan is it actually pulls a lot of air, pulls 2300 CFM, which I believe is a lot more than the original engine fan had. And we're going to gain back a little bit of horsepower that we're going to lose with our power steering pump. So I'm going to install it. Now we shouldn't do this too long, but I'm just going to do a quick bump on it, make sure the rotation is correct on it the way we want to wire it, and make sure that the fan blades are in the correct position. So I basically just hot wired this so that I can just do a quick touch off of the battery. And then we'll wire it into our relay after we have it all set up, and then we'll make sure that our fan is all installed correctly. So like I said, we're going hot to ground, ground to hot. And there's no interference, we're not hitting on anything, and the fan is pushing the correct position. Here's the final result of the wiring. Now I ran the connector in behind the horn so that you don't see it. And then I just brought the wiring up back in here. This is the wiring for the fan right here. This is the wiring for the fan trigger and for the ignition right here. Obviously I couldn't run them into the same sheathing here. Now the relay is just behind here as we showed earlier. And I did the same thing on it where I tried to keep everything neat and tidy and hide the wires as much as I can. Now the the trigger and the other wire run back down in here, and then underneath the very bottom right here, all the way across there, so that you don't see all the wiring. Now I've also got this set up so it's very close to the horns, with a lot of clearance, and everything worked out really well. Nice and centered, lots of room. Fan doesn't hit anything when it's running, and the fan has enough area to actually do something here. So I'm pretty happy with the result. Here's a little bit of a better look at all the clearance that we have with the fan. Now you can see the clearance from the horn there. Come back, you can see where I had to cut it out to miss the top bar there, part of the rad support. Clearance that we have there, and the clearance that we have there. Now looking through, see everything's all neat and tidy. The wiring for the input and for the 12 volt ignition is right here, ran all the way across. And after I'd spent some time redoing all the wiring back on here, I don't know if you can see this that well. Let's see if I can get a little bit of a light in here. I'll tidy this up a little bit. This goes all the way back to the front. And there's the 12 volt ignition. I haven't quite wired that up yet. And won't take me much longer, and we'll have that all wired up. The road draft tube on this car has been welded up in the bottom. I took a washer, I cut off the tube, welded a washer in there, filled it, and then welded the tube back on. Then in the top I welded a washer back in, used a grommet for a PCV, and made a line to run the PCV back up to the throttle body. Now it runs right here in the throttle body, across into that vacuum port. But you can see on here, I don't have the bracket on yet, and the bracket comes down to this bolt right here on the thermostat housing. So this is going to be in the way. So I'm just going to have to make a new line once the bracket's in. So I'll just take that off and I'll have to replumb it. No big deal. Two things I want to talk about before I finish up the wiring on this fan is there's two products that I really like to use. Now I'm not a real big advocate on things unless I've actually used them, and I know that they work. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is painless wiring. Has the Power Braid kit. When you open it up, it comes with all the different coverings for the different sizes and amounts of wires that you have. And the other thing that it comes with is self-vulcanizing tape for sealing your joints off, and this stuff absolutely works great. Now, I've never seen this anywhere else other than from being able to order it off of Summit. And when I went to the local speed shop, the guys couldn't find it there. It also comes with a lot of shrink sleeve, small zip ties, and larger zip ties as well. I really think that keeping the wiring neat and tidy really means a lot when you're working on something like this. Not only does it look better, it protects the wiring, and it also shows a little bit of craftsmanship on your part. And if you keep the wiring harnesses organized into their different sections, it's easier to diagnose problems if you ever have problems in the future, and ease an ability to fix those problems or at least troubleshoot them. Now the other thing are these little 3M clips And they don't look like much, but the 3M tape on them is very strong. And they've got little aluminum wings that you fold over the wire and fold the other way over. And it's going to be good for something like underneath the grill bar here, where we ran our wire for a relay, because I ran out of room in here to try and run our wires through. And use the stickies underneath the grill bar in here. Now they're going to be protected from the heat there. It's going to hold the wire up from running back and forth and rubbing inside the splash pan inside the grill here. And keeps it neat and tidy. I know where that wire is now. And if you're looking from the front of the car, you're not going to see that wire hanging down. It's not going to get pulled in and into the fan or anything like that. So I would highly recommend this, or they have other styles that are a square plate like this with a little bump that you can run a zip tie through. They also make magnetic ones. I've never used the magnetic ones, but in this application they might actually work as good or better than these, because then you can pull them off and stick them back on as you need. And they also come in the same style where they have the wings that fold down, or you can use a zip tie for that. So I highly recommend trying to keep your wiring neat and tidy. Right now I'm working on taking the old brackets off that I had for my alternator. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're working on these old inline sixes and a lot of other engines, off the top of my head I can't really name any, but a lot of the bolts that hold the water pump in, which is where our bracket was off of one of the bolts for the water pump, that is not a blind hole. That goes straight into the water jacket, and they're prone to leaking if you don't seal them properly. And what I do, I don't know if very many other guys do this, but you can use the white paste on them, made out of Teflon, or you can use Teflon tape. A lot of guys apply Teflon tape improperly, and one of the proper things to do is if you take the spool like this around your finger, pull off a piece of Teflon tape like this, and then you want to apply it in the direction that when you screw it in, it'll mash that tape down and hold it, because it's going to be our tape that seals this up. And so we want to make sure that each revolution that we have at least two wraps of our Teflon tape. I have had problems in the past with trying to use silicone, and basically what happens with silicone that you don't get with the white paste is usually pretty good at staying in the threads. As you screw it in, the silicone will try to push back, and then it leaves a big mess around where you're trying to seal up. I'd show you where it is, but I tried taking some shots with the camera. You can't really see in there very well. So I'll show you this for now, and then I'll show you once the bracket's in what it looks like with the bracket, and I'll try and get some better shots.